You'll remember from one of the previous segments that one complete cardiac cycle yields the stroke volume, which is equal to your end diastolic volume minus your end systolic volume. So your maximum volume, your minimum volume during that one complete cardiac output. During that one complete cardiac cycle, from ventricle ejection to ventricle ejection, or what have you. Cardiac output is stroke volume, shown here, and it also includes heart rate. So while the stroke volume is the milliliters that we're moving in one beat, cardiac output includes the milliliters that we're moving per minute. So we can do a little math here and look at some pretty amazing numbers if we assume a resting heart rate of 70 beats per minute on average, just to make our math easy. And we assume an average stroke volume of, say, 70 to 80 milliliters. Well, that's going to give us a cardiac output of about 5.5 liters. Or if we were to go 70 times 70, that makes the math nice and easy, then that's 4.9 liters. That's a tremendous amount of blood to be circulating every minute, considering the average 70 kilogram man is going to have maybe 8 liters of blood. 5 to 8 being reasonable numbers. Stroke volume, one way to affect cardiac output then is to change and alter this stroke volume. And there are a number of ways that we can do this. Now, again, let's throw that equation up there on the board, because you got to know this. You got to know this equation. It's really simple on its face value. So end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume. So naturally, anything that's going to alter my end systolic volume or my end diastolic volume will alter my stroke volume. And if my stroke volume changes, my cardiac output changes. Okay, so looking at end diastolic volume, the simplest way of looking at that is the volume of blood in the ventricle at the end of ventricle diastole. And that blood generates pressure, which we call preload. Now, if I increase the amount of end diastolic volume, then of course I'm going to increase stroke volume. Now then we have, this is a little bit more tricky to understand, but we have this resistance that exists, this total peripheral resistance that's going to exist. And to understand this, let's imagine if we have a pipe here, okay? So here's my pipe, and stroke volume is going to be taking fluid from my ventricle and shoving it into my pipe, right? Well, my resistance affects the pipe itself, okay? Total peripheral resistance. And in the simplest of terms, and I am going to definitely dive into this in more detail, but in the simplest of terms, a narrow pipe has greater resistance than a wide pipe, okay? And so that resistance is a force that pushes back against the force generated by the heart. And so a very narrow pipe will generate a tremendous amount of force. To overcome that force, then the heart must work harder, okay, to push the blood out through the pipe. Now, hopefully you understand that the pipe are the arteries, and there's a lot of factors that go into affecting the pressure in that artery. But that pressure is called afterload, and the larger the afterload, the harder the heart has to work. Afterload has a tendency to decrease stroke volume, primarily because it affects this end systolic volume. And systolic volume is the amount of blood left over in the heart after ventricular contraction. And if it's harder for the heart to get squeegee that blood out, then we're going to have some more leftover blood in the heart. The last factor that we need to worry about is this one called contractility. This is the one that most people forget, but I don't want you to forget it. This is simply the strength of ventricular contraction. Now, if you think back to skeletal muscle contraction, the size of the twitch can change for a lot of reasons, including frequency of action potentials. But the main reason is actually this lovely little ion right here. If I increase the amount of ion, calcium ion, in the cytoplasm, then I'm also increasing the number of cross bridges that can form, and I'm therefore increasing the force of contraction. And that's really what contractility is this increasing the force of contraction. Now, generally speaking, about 60% of the EDV is ejected during ventricular ejection. So if we assume, let's just make some nice round numbers, that my end diastolic volume is 100 milliliters. That's actually too low, but I want nice, easy numbers to play with. So 100 milliliters, then 60% of that 60 milliliters would be ejected. And so we call that the ejection fraction, the 60%. But that ejection fraction will change if my contractility changes. So if my heart is contracting harder, then I will push out more blood, and that 60% may become 70 or 80 or 90, depending on the situation.